Okay, good morning, good afternoon. So we are in between of Vancouver and Yerevan and maybe some other parts of the globe. People are from different countries. So welcome to our seminar. Before we start, I would like to provide a little bit of technical advisory. First of all, this event is conducted on Zoom meetings platform. So again, who just joined, please keep yourself muted if you are not speaking to avoid any kind of unwanted noises on the background of the recording. If you would like to ask questions, we have two presentations and there will be a Q&A after each presentation. So the questions are welcome to be sent through the chat. Everyone knows how to use chat. And this way, everyone will see your questions, including the speakers. A couple of things I would like to say about our organization for those people who are not yet familiar with it. The Canada-Eurasia Business Alliance is a Canada-based or Vancouver-based non-government, non-for-profit organization founded in February 2025. Our mandate is to foster business integration, advancing supply chains and catalyze technical exchange between Canada and the countries of Greater Eurasia regions. One of our important duty is actually keeping our members and associates informed about what's going on at the international geopolitical landscape, which is quite turmoily these years. And we are conducting numerous of various sessions about the trade regulations in the times of the trade wars and stuff like that. And today is the first session which we are organizing on sanctions, thanks to Nathan, who proposed this event. And we have two great speakers. And I hope that everyone who is attending this session will get a bunch of very interesting and important information. So now I would like to pass the stage to Nathan Hunt. I don't think he needs any special introduction, but just to say that he is a member of CEBA Board of Directors. Nathan, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Tatiana. I will also give credit to Art Franchik. I think Art is on the call. Art was also, this was his idea, and he was instrumental in organizing, reaching out to speakers and organizing the event. So I'll give credit to Art as well. We're honored and pleased to have Alex Settles here. This is the second time that he's spoken to our organization, and Vladimir Yefremov, who's also speaking to us for not the first time. I'll be brief because I think the most important thing right now is to get into the meat of it, as we say, to hear what Alex and Vladimir have to tell us. So I'll just do introductions quickly. Alex Settles is a clinical associate professor of entrepreneurship and international business in the Department of Management, academic director of the Thomas S. Johnson Master of Science in Entrepreneurship, and research director of the Entrepreneurship and Innovation Center at the Warrington College of Business, University of Florida. And then I will give Vladimir's introduction later when he begins speaking. So, Alex, let's please hear from you. Thank you again for finding the time to join us. Share with us your wisdom. What can you tell us about sanctions, where we're going, and how effective they are?
Okay, thank you, Nathan. I'll work on shortening my introduction in the future, maybe a few less titles. Yeah, so as Nathan mentioned, I'm at the University of Florida now. Previously, I was at Rutgers Business School at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And before that, I was at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So my interest in Russia is not something that's recent. And my interest in Eurasia is not something that's recent, but it's something I've been studying for a while. And over the last few years, the last 5 or 6 years, really focusing on sanctions, the effects on Russian multinationals, the effects of this on multinational firms that operate in Russia and other emerging markets, right? And so, as Nathan mentioned last year, we had a discussion because Art also was instrumental in organizing this last year, a discussion around sanctions and what the effects had been on Russian multinational firms, and had they been effective in trying to change decisions that were being made by the Russian government, right? And so I'm going to take a bit of an academic approach to it, right? So I think Vladimir will talk more on the legal aspects of it, where I'm going to talk more on the academic international business framework to it. There'll be some discussion of geopolitics and some discussion of maybe even what currently is occurring, because that's interesting to sort of see what's been going over the last few months or so, or even the last few days in this topic, because some of the things that I may talk about may in the future no longer be all that relevant, depending on how the outcome of, I think, discussions that are going on now between the United States, Russia, the United States and Ukraine, and then also discussions between the European Union and other allies, Ukraine and Russia, on sort of the discussion related to the military conflict that continues between Russia and Ukraine. But with that, what I was going to do is share some slides and talk to you a little bit about some of the research I've been doing and some of the other research that I've seen other people do on this field. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. So let's see. And I hope everyone now can see my slides, right?
We can see them.
Yeah,
Great, excellent.
perfect.
I just want to check that on your webinar, right? I was kind of interestingly enough, earlier today, I was managing a webinar on research into geopolitics and international business, right? So this is a more broad scope, but the discussion of whether or not sanctions have worked were discussed, and this paper I'm going to talk about a little bit later was in one person's slide. So I thought that was interesting that all of the things I'm doing today relate to this basic same topic, right? And so, what I've been working on over the last 5 or 6 years is trying to look at how economic sanctions have shaped, activity of Russian multinationals and of multinational firms that operate in Russia. And so, one of the basic questions that's been debated actually now for about 40 to 50 years in both political science, international relations, and international business have been: do these economic sanctions really work, right? And it depends a lot about on how you frame this question. Is it because they're working to try to change the policy decisions of the country that are sanctioned? Are you making changes in how firms operate? Are you making changes in decisions that owners of those firms are making, right? So there's a couple of different layers, and what I'll try to do in this discussion is to sort of go through that. But what I thought I would do to begin with is sort of talk a little bit about, what are the what has happened over the last year or so since we last discussed this or last presented this to this group. When I'm asked to talk about sanctions, it's like one of these things that's very complex, very detailed. This whole concept around targeted sanctions that sort of developed in the late 1990s and has been used substantially over the last 15 years with respect to Russia, and perhaps over the last 20 to 25 years as a way of putting pressure on individuals or countries to change decisions that they're making, either in their particular behavior, like sort of, for example, targeted sanctions come out of this area related to how do you punish people civilly where you can't punish them criminally. So looking at narco traffickers or weapons traffickers, that you're not able to criminally prosecute, but you can keep them outside of the international financial system, or block their purchase of real estate in certain jurisdictions, or having them spend their money or use their funds in your financial system, right? So targeted sanctions sort of developed out of that idea of how to either punish individuals or to influence government decision making. And if you see what's happened over the last year, this was actually something we were all sort of looking forward to, which is what was going to be the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And so when he came into office, initially there would have been very limited changes to the U.S. The use of sanctions by the U.S. with respect to Russia and Ukraine, and in fact, most of the attention shifted towards tariffs. And actually, kind of an interesting new policy tool that the Trump administration has begun to develop, which I'll talk a little bit at the end, is using tariffs in place of sanctions as ways of trying to get decision makers to make changes about decisions that the decision makers in the United States want to see change, right? So now you're actually like seeing this interesting intersection between elites in the U.S. trying to pressure elites in other countries to change their decisions, and not necessarily using sanctioning, but using tariffs as that way. But some of the things that have changed, right? Well, one is this task force klepto capture was dissolved by the Department of Justice. So some of the pressure that was being put on individuals in the United States regarding to their assets that are in the U.S. Lessened, right? And I actually have a student who worked for this task force. One of my MBA students worked for this task force, and her responsibility was to identify yachts in Fort Lauderdale and Miami for possible seizure. So I think we probably won't see a lot of that happening in the next few months. We didn't happen in 2025 and probably won't happen again. As I mentioned, you're also starting to see the use of tariffs as a tool. So under U.S. law, emergency tariffs that are being applied because of the avoidance, perhaps, of sanctions, right? You saw this in India. And then there have also been discussions of using those same type of emergency tariffs on China based upon trade that's going on between China and Russia. And but then more recently in October, I think after Trump met with Putin, there were some concerns that Trump wasn't living up to what I think Trump thought that they had negotiated. And so you saw this increase in sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, and targeting their subsidiaries, and basically operating under this Biden era executive order. So you see the U.S. starting to make some changes, but it seems to be on a more personal decision making as opposed to a country level policy, which is actually kind of an interesting shift, right? So then if you look at other things that the U.S. government has been trying to do over the last year, mostly trying to plug holes and cutting off the circumvention of sanctions. And actually, my current research project is looking at this, how firms have been trying to circumvent sanctions, or how individuals and firms have been doing this. And so you can see that throughout both the United States, the EU, the UK, Canada, other countries that have sanctions on Russia, they've attempted to do this, for a variety of different ways that people have tried to go around these sanctions, right? Utilizing, looking at overseas branches, looking at family members, trying to identify, complex holding structures. Like this is one that was discussed actually in this webinar I was hosting earlier today, was looking at that research of how people are utilizing these complex ownership structures. It's kind of interesting. People are rediscovering that this was a method of trying to avoid international regulations, something that was used widely in the 90s and early 2000s in Russia and other places in the Eurasia as a way of trying to avoid home market rules, but also to try to, when they operate internationally, to hide the actual ownership structure. So that seems to be another aspect of it too, right? And then, the interesting thing that's come up in the last couple of weeks, which would be interesting to hear what the perspective of people who've been watching this unfold. It's interesting to see how different the Trump administration has been from the Biden administration, and how they're interacting with these negotiations. And if you think about sort of this history of targeted sanctions, if you think about the reason why governments had been implementing them on Russia, was to try to pressure Russian elites to put pressure on Kremlin and on President Putin to make changes and decisions related to foreign policy in respect to Ukraine, right? And now what you're seeing under the Trump administration peace plan is even a much more personal set of connections. Like I understand that part of this from recent reporting that part of this recent discussion and coming up with this peace plan actually occurred here in Florida, in Miami, in Jared Kushner's place or Steve Witkoff's place in Miami in South Florida. So it's interesting to see how personal these connections now seem to play a role, and that you're seeing increasingly over the last few months that elites are coming back into play. And while they had been previously sanctioned or pressured, they're now becoming part of this discussion. And you're starting to see firms like ExxonMobil and perhaps other investors interested in re-entering the Russian market, which is also another aspect of research that I've been working on to try to see which firms will start to re-enter once this occurs, right? Once there's an opening of it. Excuse me. If you look at what some of the other countries have been doing, right? If you look at the UK and the European Union, essentially what they've been trying to do is, tighten the sanctions over the last year, particularly focusing on closing those loopholes or those ways of avoiding sanctions. Also, increased focus on prohibition of dual-use products, trying to reduce the military capacity through targeted sanctions, and then trying to exclude more people that are what they're defining as being government-linked Russians, right? So you see that in the UK. You're starting to see that also in the European Union. If you look at the number of sanctions and the detail of those sanctions, the European Union seems to have a much more broad one. Like one of the interesting aspects of the EU, and I know I've done some work looking at what Finnish firms have been doing, as really thinking about how they're restructuring their global supply chains to sort of remove Russia from those global supply chains in the future. What I think one of the most interesting aspects over the last year is the discussion on banning liquid natural gas imports starting in January of 2027, right? So that should be a really interesting component of this, and then also blocking different types of companies, Nord Stream 1 and 2 from having transactions with European firms, targeting these third-party actors and countries that are circumventing EU sanctions or helping military efforts. And then also this real interesting focus they have on the shadow fleet. Like, I don't know if you paid attention to this, but apparently there's a webcam posted in Istanbul that tracks these shadow fleet ships as they transit there. So, it is something that the Europeans are quite concerned about. And it's even gotten to this point where they're putting restrictions on travel of Russian diplomats in the EU, right? That there is this real concern about, how Russia has responded to the sanctions in the European Union and how they're going to continue to manage that in the future, right? And so it sort of leads us to, are these sanctions effective in making changes in government policy? Well, from the academic perspective, you've seen this area has become very popular, and there's been an expanding in scope, right? And you can see a significant uptick in publications that are coming out since 2021 related to sanctions. And you can see looking at some of the meta-analysis, looking at all of these studies, like some of the things we did in our research, but just this past year, there was a new meta-analysis that came out that looked at these empirical studies, that basically looked up until 2018. So basically looking at these sanction regimes in the past. And there are some of these interesting conditions that sort of come through when you look across these different studies. That pre-sanction trade links are important, and I think this is like one of the components that, from the U.S. perspective, has always been an issue related to sanctioning Russia, is that the amount of trade that occurred prior to the sanctioning regime being adopted was relatively small, at least for the U.S. perspective. And so U.S. sanctioning Russia, had perhaps limited impact on economic trade between the countries. And then the other issue too is that duration matters. if you think about the length of sanctions now, they're over 10 years, and there seems to be declining value to those sanctions. And the sanctions that have been adopted since 2022 now have been in place for more than 2.5, 3 years. So it seems like if there isn't a swift resolution, the power of these sanctions to make changes seem to have relatively limited value. And then I think one of the important components that, when we were doing our research, seemed to be like one of the big issues that economists seem to be overlooking is that, sanctions work when firms are focused on whether or not those rules matter to their global or their international operations, right? So sanctioning a US-based firm or a UK-based firm by the United States seems to have a greater impact than trying to sanction a firm that is not based in an ally or doesn't rely on the global supply chain or financial markets connected to the United States, right? So this prior relations component seems to be a big issue, right? And then I think the other concern, which is starting to happen over the last couple of years, is that these targeted sanctions have shifted. I mentioned this earlier, have shifted from being sanctions that focused on criminals that you couldn't criminally prosecute, but you were trying to make sure civilly they didn't benefit from their criminal activity, to then being targeted sanctions that are trying to shape government policy by having a consistent policy, country level policy framework that you then try to enforce through sanctioning individuals around the decision maker in that country, which I'd say would be what the targeted sanctions towards Russia have been, to now almost sanctions being used anytime there is a policy difference. And I heard this interesting term called parochial political concerns, which I think make these sanctions even less effective, right? Is, that, it's maybe one thing to cut out an arms dealer from owning a house in Miami, to going towards, can you really influence a country leader by sanctioning the people around them, to now disputes on whether or not you back green energy at the UN, meaning that you won't give visas to family members of people who are representing the European countries in that discussion, which is what a recent suggestion of sanctions were, right? So that it seems to further undermine their effectiveness in making decisions, right, or changing decisions. So going back to the research we did, I talked a little bit about why, what we were interested in, and what we were trying to do is really look at the financial performance of sanctioned firms. Not to go into a whole lot of detail of this, but essentially what we were thinking was to look at the financial performance. What we found, of course, is that sanctions did not seem to have an effect on the political situation. But if you look at the actual financial performance, it seems as if it had relatively limited impact on Russian firms, even directly sanctioned Russian firms, right? And what you did see was you saw that what companies did was they adapted to those sanction regimes, changed maybe their global supply chain, perhaps shut down some of the subsidiaries that were most exposed to those sanctioning regimes, and developed new global supply chains or new ways of distributing their products internationally, so that they did not necessarily were not necessarily being stopped from engaging in international business activity because of those sanctioning regimes. And then you also saw the Russian government step in and shield some of those companies that were particularly important to developing the Russian economy, right? So what have we seen since last year in the research area is looking at how firms have tried to adapt themselves to these types of sanctioning regimes, and then also looking some at this network of hyper elites that are starting to play this role of negotiators, actors, and conduits for sanction avoidance. So there's been like some discussion related to how do the people who are involved in these multinational firms, how do they play a role in this, and then what are some of the political or social constraints on their behavior. So if you take a look at some of that research, you can take a look at this recent research looking at CEOs and divestment. Why is it that U.S. firms divested from Russia after 2022? And so what one set of authors did was look at the liberal conservative leaning of the CEOs and see if that played a role in the divestment pattern. And it seems that what they found was people who had more of a liberal political activity prior to their decision from leaving Russia, they seem to be more likely to leave Russia than those who had more of a conservative leaning political activity prior to the decision of leaving Russia. So there does seem to be some role that these CEOs and elites are playing in the decisions on whether or not firms leave Russia. And it probably also plays a role in how those firms are working with Russian firms or with firms from Eurasia in this time frame. And so, sort of thinking about why, what the different characteristics of decision makers were on whether they were going to divest. And then, sort of looking at those political ideology, how did they figure that out? They were looking at, focus on social justice or openness to change, and that, they sort of align people in those two frameworks, and then thinking about how that played a role in their decision. And then if you look at what Russian firms have done or Western firms have done in Russia, is that you see quite a few of them have tried to withdraw. Some are staying in Russia or have stayed in Russia. And some of them are trying to avoid being either captured or having their assets expropriated by the Russian government. And I think one of the big questions that we've been working on is thinking about why companies have stayed and which companies are going to come back in the future. Okay, and I've given a couple of examples here in my notes. I don't know if I have time to go through all of them, but some of you may be more up to date on what they've done. But what I wanted to do is to take a look at some additional new research. So some authors who I've been interacting with, they were interested in this question of what was the role of public sentiment in their decision to remain within the country, and whether or not those how well those companies did, those who did remain within that host country. So they were looking at multinational subsidiaries and what they were planning to do. And here's where I think you see some of the impacts, right? Is that sanctions seem to increase stakeholder announcements or what sort of interaction they had to do with trying to maintain that legitimacy there. And that sanctions also seem to have a negative effect post-sanction subsidiary performance, right? And so essentially these sanctions, as you well know, create a legitimacy issue for subsidiaries and multinational companies that continue to operate within that country. And it seems like that is one part of what sanctions have been doing. But whether or not they've actually changed what's going on within those specific countries, even though there seems to be this cost, there doesn't seem to be this effectiveness in changing decisions, right? Some of the other research that seems to be out there is looking at political connectivity. That essentially it looks like that pro-Russia countries, firms that are based in pro-Russia countries, face similar or worse returns than firms based in pro-Ukrainian countries. Essentially sanctions hurt all of the markets, but it does seem that being aligned with Russia amplified some of their financial risk. And then another set of research that's going on that's looking at sanctioning is looking at the diversion of trade through third-party countries. And you're starting to see a series of, especially international economics papers that are documenting this shift of trade, a shift of, if you look at the China-Russia trade, you can see the redirection of trade through China. You can also see the use of countries like Georgia, for example, as a conduit for moving oil and oil products out of Russia. And essentially, if you look at the sanctioning regimes, you can see that countries have found this to be occurring. But what the academic research is showing that, yes, that is what's happening. You can see this shift of trade to third-party countries. So, sort of thinking about, sort of the next steps are, what's happening in the geopolitical situation. Clearly, you can see this divergence in sanction regimes. The interesting news around this topic has been the peace plan that the Trump administration has put forward, and that can clearly have some real change in, I think, how people perceive whether or not sanctions worked or didn't work in Russia, and what was the right aspect, or what policy tools worked well to create that change. But I think one of the interesting things that's occurred through this process is you can see this reassertion of the roles of elites in the negotiating process. I think the shift from the Biden to the Trump administration, has shifted U.S. policy, at least, from being a, like almost a country level interest to being an elite level interest on whether or not this situation is going to be resolved, right? And overall, I think if you look at the evidence, looking at targeted sanctions and whether or not they've been able to change the outcomes within these geopolitical disputes. I mean, you can see within Russia, you can also see this within China, that there is a limited effectiveness of whether those sanctions make policy changes, but they do seem to be alternatives to other, I guess, more more negative consequences, right? So I think like the reason why people have adopted targeted sanctions is that broad-based sanctions have larger unintended negative consequences for both the sanctioned country and the home country issuing those sanctions. You can see that if you go back and look at country level sanctions against Cuba or North Korea. And in both cases, those sanctions have not led to changes in the Cuban government or the North Korean government or even in their government policies, but have had long, substantial economic impact on the Cuban people and the North Korean people, right? And so targeted sanctions do seem to have some policy differences to those broad-based sanctions, but whether or not they've been effective in changing political decisions, I think still there seems to be limited evidence that happens. Short run sanctions that are on perhaps allies or countries that are more greatly integrated seem to play a stronger role than trying to sanction a country that may have limited economic ties or doesn't necessarily depend on the sanctioning country for their economic growth or economic development. That seems to be what the research has shown. And we've shown it at the firm level. Other researchers have shown it at the national level. Okay. So why don't I turn it back over to Nathan, and then we can hear from Vladimir.
Thank you, Alex, very much. I think we can have Q&A now, right, Tatiana? Okay. I think we can have Q&A right after the speakers' presentations. I will say you went through breakneck speed, I would say, through those slides.
Sorry.
And some of them I wish I could have seen a little more detail on, especially on the potential return of Western companies to the Russian market, or the inability of Western companies to return to the Russian market. That has been a key topic to be discussed at economic fora in the recent, I would say, in the last 18 months. And I'm very interested to hear your thoughts, for instance, about McDonald's. Is there any chance that McDonald's could return to the market? A lot of people think not. You had some other companies shown in that one slide that you went very quickly through it. I'm curious of your thoughts about it. Are there any Western companies that could or should return to the market? You did mention ExxonMobil. Is that perhaps the only one?
That I've seen recently being reported, right, that ExxonMobil has already gotten into discussions about returning to the Sakhalin Island venture that they were previously in. I mean, what we've been trying to, actually, this is a current research project, and I guess I would like to get feedback from people who are working in the environment, because what we're trying to do is to figure out what are those indicators. Like, for example, McDonald's. I guess the question there is does McDonald's still own the trademark for McDonald's in Russia? Would they be able to re-enter the market, even if they weren't able to acquire the subsidiary that they sold prior to their exit? Would they be able to re-enter? Would they have that ability to do that? And I think that's one thing that we've been trying to take a look at. I mean, first, we're looking at all of these Western firms who have either made declarations they were leaving or maybe made declarations they weren't leaving. There are a variety of different databases that have been trying to track that movement, who stayed, who left. Those who have stayed obviously will probably be able to re-enter more quickly. You may remember from the crisis, there was a bunch of research done on the crisis in 1997, 1998, and those firms that stayed in the Russian market, even during that economic downturn, did much better in the early 2000s as the market began to rebound and grow, right? So there may be some similarity, that could be continued your commitment there. You may be able to expand, even though you've been pressured by your home market stakeholders or home market governments to withdraw or reduce your aspect. But this is actually an interesting component because at least my understanding is a lot of fast-moving consumer good firms left Russia, but their products didn't leave Russia, right? So the question would be is how would they re-enter? Would they re-enter in the same terms? They may, I think since the dispute I don't think the dispute will be settled, right? In the even if this peace plan is adopted, that there still would be, significant geopolitical risk to re-enter into the market in the way that they may have entered 10 years ago. So at least what my colleagues and I have been discussing is what will be that form of re-entry, right? Maybe you will see a company like McDonald's re-enter or a company like IKEA re-enter, but they'll re-enter in a way where they may not make the same level of commitment or make a different type of commitment so that in case the risk increases. And I guess there are a variety of different ways of thinking about that, right? Who kept their representative office? Who kept their legal forum? Who maintains their trademarks? Who are maintaining their physical presence or employees? All of those things, I think, are indicators of whether or not they're going to be able to re-enter. And then also the other big question, like from McDonald's, for example, is will Russians want to go to a McDonald's in the future? Right? I mean, if you think back to when they first entered, right, this was this era of where everything Western was interesting and American products were had a selling point just on that basis, right? So it would be interesting to see how the market would be different.
Any other questions for our speaker, for Alex Settles?
Can I ask a question? Am I muted?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, Alex. Nice, very clear presentation. Now, as we see these negotiations going on between call it Russia and Ukraine, you're seeing on the list of 28 points a removal of sanctions. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on that? That how would they be removed, like in phased down, or if they get an agreement, again, like I said, something phased down over a number of years or something like this, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, from looking at what the Trump administration has been doing in general, I think it'll be basically, I would say, a transactional deal, right? I mean, if you would compare the difference between sanctions under Biden and sanctions under Trump, without, I mean, I don't have any inner knowledge of what's going on, but just looking at how they have approached these discussions. I mean, I think for the Biden administration, they were looking for a clear end to the war and to a clear, security situation for Ukraine and their sovereignty over the land that they claim is theirs, right? So I think that the difference between the approach the Biden administration was looking at, where I think you probably would have seen some sort of conditional staging of sanctions based upon adherence to any type of ceasefire or peace plan. Whereas I think in the Trump administration, based upon what they've been doing with other countries, I think it's going to be more of a series of deals, right? So I think, I mean, at least this is my impression, and having talked to other people that are looking at this issue, looking at how the decision making is being made, is it's almost like the sanctions will be unwound based upon how the people within the network are negotiating it. So this back to the point I made around elites. It's like which elite person will be participating. Like I'll give you a good example on a different topic, right? A good example of this is looking at how the CHIPS Act restricted distribution of certain types of, new cutting edge, especially GPU AI based chips. There was this idea that they shouldn't be sold to China or sold to countries where you wouldn't necessarily have clear control over the security of those chips, the use of the technology. And that was what the Biden administration set out. They had a clear national policy on this and a set of rules and regulations about where they could be distributed. Then it turns to the Trump administration, and the Trump administration makes I think, basically a deal between Donald Trump and the Emir of the United Arab Emirates, where they decided that they were going to, allow NVIDIA to sell a certain number of chips to UAE to build their AI supercomputer, their AI processing center, right? And you could see that there was a policy that the U.S. government had, but there was this individual deal. So, Art, if you're thinking about how the sanctions will be unwound, I would suggest that they'll probably be unwound at a individual type of deal situation. So, like if there's a deal between ExxonMobil and Rosneft, or if there's a deal with assets related to Lukoil or assets related to Nord Stream, I would think, from what I've been looking at, what's going on in the Trump administration, is that it'll be a transactional deal that'll have some sort of benefit to the United States and some sort of benefit to the company in the U.S. or the investor in the U.S. who's making that deal, right? So I think there may be, I think what you would like to see is a consistent policy so you can make plans based on whether or not you're going to re-enter the market or expand in the market. But it looks like it's going to be more of individual deals or sectoral deals, I would think.
A piecemeal, I guess, is the word I would use, huh?
What's that?
Piecemeal is the word I would use.
Yeah, piecemeal. I mean, I think it'll be individual deal sets. Like, you'll probably see exemptions being made or issuances of new licenses, like within because I think what the thing is the idea. I mean, and this has been the idea that the Trump administration has used with tariffs, right? Is you're not using them as a policy tool, you're using them as a negotiation tool, right? It's not a government policy that, the specific country is doing a specific action and you want them to do something different, or you want to gain access for American companies within that marketplace. It's more of we want you to do X, Y, and Z, and we're going to put a tariff or sanction on you until you do that, until you make that decision. And so I would assume as they unwind them, where they were wound up in a certain way to sort of pressure oligarchs close to Putin and to deny access for Russian companies to make money in the oil and gas marketplace, and to deny them access to military supplies, right? That's a lot of the political justification, policy justification for the current sanctions. But as they're unwound, they'll probably be unwound more on a transactional basis of, this person or this group wants to enter into the market under these terms and conditions, we'll remove these sanctions based upon it, right? So, I mean, I think it's going to create real issues for policymakers and, legal advisors about how you would interpret those rules if they're not consistent. They're not being consistently applied. But if you look at how tariffs in other countries are being handled, it seems to be it's that way. Or looking at how the CHIPS Act is being implemented, it seems to be based on a transaction by transaction or situation by situation basis.
You had mentioned trademarks, and Paul Jones was kind enough to put into the chat that franchisers who left Russia put buyback clauses into the sale of their assets agreements and preserve their trademarks. So that's one, I would say, aspect of that particular topic. Are there any other questions for our speaker, for Alex Settles, before we move on? If not, I will then introduce Vladimir Yefremov, who specializes in international trade issues, sanctions and export control, customs and currency regulations, WTO regulation, direct and indirect taxation of domestic and cross-border deals, FCPA and compliance audits, product quality requirements and liability, and data cybersecurity issues. Vladimir also advises clients on effective strategies for entering and exiting the Russian market and on compliance with Russian countermeasures. He has headed a number of projects for the localization of foreign products and technologies, as well as ensuring their compliance with the criteria for Made in Russia status. In addition, Vladimir actively advises technology companies on IT regulatory issues in Russia. Vladimir is a partner with Melling, Wojtyshkin and Partners. Vladimir, the floor is yours. What can you tell us about sanctions?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan, for your introduction. That was like very detailed, I would say. So didn't expect to hear so many details, I would say. Alex, thank you for your presentation and a great economic overview of the sanctions impact. While preparing for the presentation, I'm sorry, for some reason, like the camera is working a little bit strangely, so sorry for that. But basically, I was thinking, okay, so when we're talking about effectiveness of sanctions, what should we basically discuss and what the attorneys could bring here as a new thing, right, for discussion and analysis. And then I thought, okay, so what I better do is just, provide my view on how the sanctions basically are changing to a certain extent, what's new we can see. And based on that, just make some sort of legal analysis of those, let's say, changes in modifications. So if you can see my presentation, so then I can kick off, I think. Is it okay?
We can see everything. We can see everything, Vladimir. Thank you.
Okay, superb. So this is in presentation mode. Well, so a few probably remarks before we will start regarding EU and US, right? Clearly, 2025 basically demonstrated that there could be serious differences in terms of the approaches. We've seen like quite standard, I would say, periodic sanctions packages introduced by the European Union. And at the same time, you may have seen like on January 9, the previous administration introduced the very last set of sanctions. Then we've seen there were like several minor modifications. For example, President Trump revoked one of the general licenses authorizing payments for oil and energy through some of the sanctioned banks, like Alpha Bank, for example. Yeah, of course, like no surprise, but the Executive Order 14024, which is the basis for the sanctions that are being introduced starting from 2022. Although, by the way, this executive order was introduced in April of 2021 for 3 years, so that was extended. No surprise. And then again, like just relatively new, unexpected sanctions on two of the Russian largest oil energy companies. I mean, of course, Rosneft and Lukoil. That was quite a surprise. But that's like you cannot compare definitely, right? So the difference, and I think so. This one basically is perfectly summarizing what is happening, right? So you may have read, so that's the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Mr. Scott Bessent, commented. I think although this comment is relatively equal to what the U.S. Was and still doing, but of course that was related to the 19th EU sanctions package that was expected to be released. So in my mind, Commander Scott Bessent, if you're going to do something 19 times, you failed, right? So, and again, I very much liked what Alex just said, is that effectiveness of the sanctions is largely depends how you will frame it. So what effectiveness is, because it's not like, a stable thing. We'll understand the economy is changing. Is it just a reaction to sanctions, or is just reaction to how the situation should be, evolving? Very difficult to say. But again, when we're looking at all those type of sanctions, I think having this 3-year period, we can make some sort of conclusions and see some results. Well, first of all, we can have a look on the statistics on sanctioning of non-Russian companies, because every sanctions package, whatever is introduced in the EU or that's introduced in the US, we may see so that not only Russian legal entities and individuals are designated. Historically, the US was using the concept of secondary sanctions, and with respect to Russia, that was first introduced in one of the executive orders related to Crimea, 13685, back in 2014. Then this concept was basically reiterated to a certain extent in Article 228 of famous Katsa law. But when we're talking about EU, we haven't seen this right happening probably until 2023. Then EU started to introduce something similar to the concept of the secondary sanctions in the US. And so far, you can see like there are some designations of the companies that are registered, incorporated, in Russia, both in the EU and the US. The number in the EU is basically growing. And you can basically find out that the major portion of those entities that are designated, they're either located in United Arab Emirates. We will talk about this also when we will look to the other slide, but also quite obviously China and then Turkey. To a certain extent, they might be viewed as new Russian trade partners. And I think the fact that so many companies are being designated from those jurisdictions is just, confirming this. Of course, I was not analyzing the Russian foreign trade statistics regarding shift, let's say, from EU and Russia companies and effectively from exports coming from those countries. But I would say if we're looking on those designations, that's like a separate source of information to have a better understanding with which companies and countries Russian companies are trading. Although, of course, and we should underline that not necessarily those entities are trading, let's say, with their homeland, with the goods originated from their homeland jurisdictions. Because when you will look effectively on the reasons why those companies were designated, you may find specifically reference to sanction circumvention, meaning that those entities were used as special vehicles to bypass the sanctions. Or according to, let's say, clarifications provided by the EU Commission, they were used for getting a substantial source of revenue to the Russian government, or like that's another trend. So companies associated with the shadow fleet, that's how those vessels carrying Russian oil nowadays are called. And again, like in the US, so probably the grounds for the introduction of sanctions, they are more or less similar to what we see is happening in the EU. Probably what is also specifically indicated is that Russian companies, non-Russian companies that are although supporting Russia's military industrial base, so they should be designated, and that's like it seems to be in compliance with the conclusions and the results of the research made by Alex. We've heard like that's one of the US foreign policies. By the way, importantly is that at some point of time, if and when there will be discussion on uplifting sanctions, I think that's highly likely everything related to the Russian military industrial base. I mean, export control, ITAR restrictions, and then sanctions, likely they will survive. But we'll see, right? Probably right now it's too early to discuss this aspect. Again, like looking on how the sanctions are structured, because every new sanctions package basically, I think, are targeting two things. One is basically to find some new, not yet affected part of the Russian economy, and then just to introduce relevant restrictions, but also, and this is what Scott Bennett was talking about in his quote that I've just provided, is to fix basically and to close the loops that were made in the previous sanctions. So, and when they're analyzing that, again, what we can see is happening is that first of all, there is clearly a shift of centers of economic gravity, so that the trade is flowing into neutral jurisdictions countries. In Russia, they have like another name. They're called friendly jurisdictions. So those are, of course, countries from primarily Asia, Middle East. It might be Africa, Latin America. But obviously, we can see that is happening. Again, what allows us to make such conclusions is again the list of the entities and jurisdictions where they're incorporated. The sanctions introduced on the Russian energy, basically, as well as some other areas of economics, basically seems to be, improving links in between China and India, also like supporting their economic growth. So that will be quite interesting to see, basically, how the situation will be evolving. Yeah, we've seen those commands provided by President Trump regarding India and possibly some other tariff sanctions that might be introduced. But so far, it seems like those discussions had some relatively narrow effect, at least because we haven't seen any new sanctions being introduced, which doesn't mean nothing wouldn't come. So it really depends. Another quite important observation is that quite a lot of banks were designated, right? So, and we know, like, even when banks were not designated and they still continue to operate on the Russian market, in fact, there are just few left. But they're very much concerned regarding any type of inbound and outbound payments, looking basically in details on every transaction. And of course, anyone still doing business in Russia obviously is claiming that they're facing a serious problems with cross-border payments, so that the banks are extremely conservative. They're illustrating obviously over-compliance in their approaches. But the same applies not only to Russian banks that are still present on the market, but also to any other banks that might be, dealing anyhow with Russia-related counterparties, right? So any transaction, let's say, which is in between even China and United Arab Emirates, might face serious problems in case compliance of banks will identify, let's say, any links with Russia, right? And we see that's also not just based on the sanctions packages that we're analyzing today, but also based on the requests we're receiving from the clients. And the thing is that it seems like the effect those limitations have, it's really not about the industry players to which the designers of the sanctions would like to provide some negative impact, but rather than on those that should not have been affected, but they are affected, they are impacted by those sanctions. So that's why, like, obviously, we see like another trend is that those companies or companies from those sectors that were sanctioned, they basically moving to some alternative solutions, and specifically they're using cryptocurrencies. And at the few years ago, like back in 2023, probably the fees for use of the cryptocurrencies were relatively high. So it was sometimes even 10-15%. That's what we've heard. Right now, the fees went seriously down, and it's roughly about 2%. So that's why, like, again, those who should have been affected, they effectively found a way out. But those who were not designed to be targets for those sanctions, in fact, are dealing with all those delays, problems, and need to provide tons of different unnecessary documents, and in fact fight with compliance of the banks. So that's kind of a reality here. And of course, this presentation was prepared a few days ago, but by coincidence, I've read today that was an interview made by Maxim Oreshkin, who is advisor to the Russian president on economics, and he specifically indicated one very important thing is that due to the fact that in Russia, mining of cryptocurrencies growing due to a number of reasons. One, of course, it's a possibility to get income, but there is obviously a second reason. So that is becoming one of the Russian exports. I mean, mining of cryptocurrencies, and that is also, of course, needed for trade, and that negatively influences the USD ruble rate. So that was probably an explanation of why a ruble is right now growing compared to the US dollar. So that's why, again, quite interesting thing that might have impacted basically the whole setup. Yeah, so we are continuing this discussion on impact of sanctions on financial transaction. So we talked about increased compliance requirements. We talked basically about the delays. Sometimes the companies need to make several efforts to send money. It might be 4 or 5 attempts. Just basically looking when an attempt will be successful. Sometimes even quantity matters, because if you have like 10 tries, one of those might be successful. And of course, the reason why the banks are that conservative is just because there was determination made a couple of years ago introducing special regime on foreign financial institutions, so that if they are transacting and if they're facilitating transactions with the Russian industrial complex, which is defined extremely broadly, like covering almost everything. So they might be themselves designated. So that was the reason for banks becoming, extremely complicating in dealing with that. And of course, the response was quite obvious. So not only cryptocurrencies were used and are used by the business, but also the companies are moving to other banks which are transacting in other currencies. And of course, this shift was also noticed by the policymakers, both in the US and in the EU. You may have seen that some of the cryptocurrencies, in fact, were designated. For example, Garantex, one of the largest exchanges of cryptocurrencies, was designated, and Greenex. Quite recently, you introduced sanctions on the Russian stablecoin, which is called A7A5. I was even surprised when I was driving my car and I was listening to radio, and there was an advertisement made regarding use of the stable coin for cross-border transactions, and I just got an idea. Okay, so if this solution is basically advertised in that way, so what effectively it means? So no-brainer, this will be noticed, and then we will see, the reaction, and the reaction in fact followed. So stable coin was designated, and all EU person, in fact, are prohibited to anyhow deal with that. Are guys standing behind the stable coin A7I5 that stupid? No, obviously no. I think that they're that smart, and obviously they made relevant analysis, and I think for them it was obvious, so that even if the organization standing behind, as well as the stable coin itself, are designated, that shouldn't have a serious impact on their operations, and likely that is the case. So what impact of sanctions we see regarding foreign business in Russia? Yeah, there was a question regarding, the foreign companies that are still operating, and Alex provided his view. I will probably, touch upon that shortly, because that's the right moment to do so. In my view, there is a bunch of reasons why the companies are on the market. So, of course, some of the companies do operate because their operations simply are not captured by the sanctions. It's for life sciences companies, it's agricultural companies, some others. Some of the companies simply are trapped here in Russia due to the Russian countermeasures. They cannot get consent from the Russian Governmental Commission, or in certain instances even from the Russian president, to be able to exit. So that's why, they're in the situation then when they cannot basically operate in full. So they need, to wind down their operations or modify those operations somehow, and at the same time they cannot leave. So I mean, it's a mixture of different type of let's say reasons why the companies are there. Although, like you may have seen in the very last 19th EU package, EU again extended for 1 year the possibility to get a license from national authorities for exiting the Russian market in case there will be some, part of the transaction in full will be, violating the EU sanctions. So a license could be obtained and special derogation was granted for that. And again, quite importantly, so when there was the December 2024 EU sanctions package, and when the derogation was provided for 1 year, because before that it was granted for 6 months. And an interesting thing is that it was commented that this time the derogation is granted not for 6 months, but for 12 months. And it was this explanation was worded in a way that it should be read that there will be no other derogations. And we see, like in the 19th package, so there was another derogation granted regardless of those clarifications provided back then in December 2024. Yeah, sanctions, well, when we're talking how effective they are, of course, it has some economic effect in terms of prices. We'll see, and we'll can see basically how the prices are going up for not only goods originating from those countries that are introducing sanctions, but even for goods coming from friendly jurisdictions like China. Probably a good example, obvious for everyone, is situation on automobile market. When in fact, so such a withdrawal led to change basically of the domestic, I would say, change of the cars you may meet on the Russian streets, on the Moscow streets. For example, so you may see some new Chinese brands. Those living here in Russia, as myself, of course, we used to those new brands. And we see, like on the streets, you may see like new dealers that are like trading with Chinese brands rather than BMW, Mercedes, some other brands they were trading in the past. So obviously we see that the number of registrations for IP basically and trademark is also changing. So the companies from other jurisdictions are really paying high attention to the Russian market. They're registering their IP rights to be able, to protect that in case this will, constitute any threat to their presence on the Russian market. And by the way, we still see the US and EU companies still filing for their IP trademarks. And that's not a surprise. I know from my IP partners who are doing this work, I mean, registering IP and know-how, trademarks, other related things. So I know the story that even during USSR period, the US corporations were registering their IP rights in Soviet Union. So that's why, like, no one is surprised this practice will be continued. And of course, an important thing is that we also see like what really has a serious impact on the companies here in Russia is the ban that was introduced by the US. I mean, the investment ban. That's probably the core thing of the whole US strategy, because that seriously, undermines activities of the companies here in Russia due to the requirements. For example, the Russian regulatory authorities are raising to be able, for example, to distribute dividends. They're asking for more investments to come. And then how can you do that if you have an investment ban? And by the way, in the recent EU sanctions package, we're seeing to a certain extent similar mechanism introduced by the EU, but specifically with respect to special economic zones, not like the whole Russian economy. So the ban applies just to special economic zones. So there are like some peculiarities how this should apply. Probably that's something that needs to be discussed separately. And then, of course, what we also see is happening is, let's say, unintended consequences when some sanctions are introduced. So then the effect of those sanctions, basically, some although may say this is something that wasn't predicted. Others may object and say, well, no, indeed, that's not an intended consequence. This was a design and the real target of those sanctions. But in any way, we've seen like there were situations when sanctions were introduced, and then there were like separate measures undertaken basically to try to fix, or let's say to modify application of sanctions in a way basically removing, let's say, the part of those sanctions. For example, such discussion, well, it's not a discussion, but you may have seen those limitations, how they were like applied with respect to services, right? And then basically the EU countries, for example, started introducing special carve-outs from the general rule, outlining in which cases, for example, the services might be provided. So that, of course, softened the whole effect of those sanctions. Well, with that, I think I'm just coming to the end of my presentation, and will be glad to address any questions our dear audience may have. Nathan, over to you.
Sorry, I'm trying to unmute myself.
You've succeeded.
Yes. So thank you very much for that very detailed description. You just touched on the concept of special economic zones. Do they, is it really realistic to look at them in any meaningful way? Do they play any meaningful role in the current environment, Vladimir?
Well, they continue to operate. I understand, Nathan, the reason you're asking the question, because initially, special economic zones, they were like centers of gravity, right, for foreign investments into Russia, providing for certain tax, customs incentives to the residents of those special economic zones. But I would say probably nowadays, those facilities that were created during last decade or even more than this, they're still used, right? There are still residents that are operated, let's say, by the foreign HQs, right? We're not saying here about new investors. Some of those facilities were sold, right? And they were sold, and now they're used by Russian, basically, operators, Russian owners. And some of those special economic zones are basically famous for its production, which I think some of the let's say policymakers don't like. So that's why, like, I mean, specifically, some IT and drones probably, and that's why like those sanctions were designated. Sorry, those sanctions were introduced. Yeah, Nathan, it seems we were like called by our kids exactly at the same moment, like your daughter and my son, like on the telephone, but just a coincidence.
Okay. So are there any other questions for Vladimir Yefremov?
Just a request, Vladimir, can you please send me your presentation, because it was frozen on my screen. I did not want to interrupt because I did not want to lose the connection completely. So please send it to me. And if someone in the crowd did not see the slides changing,
we didn't get to see our slides, Vladimir. They were frozen, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Oh wow! So yeah, so definitely we'll send it to you.
Okay.
You should have said. Probably there was a chance to fix it.
We thought maybe you weren't using the slides. I'm not sure. So anyway, I apologize for that. But any other questions for Vladimir? If not, I guess I will turn it over to you, Tatiana, to make some concluding remarks and say thank you to you for your excellent leadership in this transition time to the Canada-Eurasia Business Alliance, and B, thank you for your help in setting up this great event.
Thank you, Nathan. I would like to thank, in my regard, everyone who participated in organizing this event. And Alex and Vladimir, thank you for absolutely exceptional information. We are actually dealing with the companies who are suffering from what's going on and the geopolitical landscape, and sometimes we have to step in to provide some assistance at the extent we are able to do that. But it's always important to actually know what's going on and what are the kind of future steps forward to be able to mitigate the risks and problems arising from what's going on in the world economy right now. So again, thank you very much, and I hope to stay in touch with you.
Thank you.
In terms of the future things, I would like to invite everyone to our mining conference, which is going to happen in Vancouver on the margins of the Roundup, organized by the Canadian Association of the Mineral Explorations. So it will likely happen on the 27th of January. I will be sending information around, so everyone who is in Vancouver, you are very welcome to come. We expect visitors from 4 countries, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and Uzbekistan this year. And the bunch of very interesting questions will be discussed in there. So please take your time and save the date. And
Thank you, Tatiana.
yeah, Nathan,
I'll
you are
also
very
mention that we
welcome.
have sorry, Tatiana. Yeah, go ahead and finish it.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell you that you are very welcome if you are going to be around Canada. Yeah.
Great.
So and my last point is thank you everyone who joined this event. If we are not speaking by end of December, I wish everyone a very merry holiday season and all the best for you to coming into the new year.
Thank you. I should note that for any of you people on this call who are in Moscow, you're welcome to join our holiday reception, which will be the day after tomorrow on Thursday night at the Mamezon Hotel. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Vladimir.
Thank you.
Look forward to our future contacts.
Take care.
Thank you very
bye-bye
much.
now.
And have a good night or a successful day.
Thank you, Tatiana. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.